Hi. I hope this is working. Let me know if you can see me, hear me, all of those things. Hi. I'm Shree. I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me. Hello to multiple people who have said hello. And someone says namaste. Hello to you too. Okay, I think you all can see me and can hear me. Right. Thank you. Hello to Insha. It's a really nice name. Okay, we are 13 minutes late, unfortunately, due to some odd technological issues from my end. I seem to be haunted by technological issues. But today we're going to be carrying on with We're Not Afraid to Die If We Can Be Together, which is the grade 11 lesson that we started earlier today. I did the first part from 3 to 4, if you want to go check that out. This is a continuation of that. We had to stop because the 1 hour limit was up, but we weren't done with the lesson. So we'll be finishing off the rest of it right now. Yes, this is Hornbill Chapter 2. That is what we're doing. And yes, I do speak in English. I should probably let you know this in advance because people generally do ask me this, but I can't speak Hindi. I do understand if you're going to be saying something in Hindi to me, but I don't know the language myself well enough to speak it. So all of my lessons are going to be in English, but if you have a question or you have a doubt, then please feel free to keep asking them in the chats and I'll keep checking them at intervals, and so I'll keep an eye on whatever is not working and we'll work it out together. I hope that sounds good to you. With that said, let's aim to complete this lesson by the end of this hour. We're halfway through it, as I said, so we've just finished until this segment where Suzanne tells her father, oh, I've just got a bump on my head, and her father, who is Gordon Cook, who is the writer and narrator of the story, says, okay, this is something I can't think about right now. I have to carry on and keep fixing the ship. So he goes ahead and he keeps fixing the ship, and what he's done now is to sort of put up like canvas in all of those places that holes have been created in the ship deck, and so now the water is no longer falling into the ship whenever the waves are breaking over the ship. Rather, the water is falling off the ship back into the ocean. So that is the last thing that has happened. And now let's go on to our next paragraph. I will check the chat every couple of minutes so that we can figure out what's happening. And if you have questions, I'll look at them then. Okay, just gonna laser pointer. More problems arose when our hand pumps started to block up with the debris floating around the cabins and the electric pump short-circuited. So we know that the ship has been filling with water and people have been pumping it out. The two crewmen have been pumping it out. But what's happened is debris, which means, ruined things. And here the ruined things are all of the things that, a lot of the ship has been breaking, right? So all of the wood probably and all of the things in the cabins that have been washed off by the water, all of this is what the debris refers to here. All of this is floating around everywhere, and because of that the hand pumps stop working because they start getting blocked up with that debris as they're pumping it out. So it's as they suck the water in, they're also sucking the debris in. So imagine like little pieces of wood getting stuck in the pump, and so the pump's not working anymore. And the electric pump that they also have on the ship short circuits. So now they've run out of pumps, which is a problem because the ship is still filling with water. And because the ship is still filling with water, it's going to sink if they don't get the water out. So they really need to find an alternative immediately. The water level rose threateningly. So the water level in the ship is rising, and it's rising threateningly, which is to say the threat of them sinking is getting more severe. Back on deck, I found that our 2 spare hand pumps had been wrenched overboard. So Gordon goes back on deck and he looks for the spare pumps that they have around, and he finds out that in the process of getting tossed around in the waves, those spare pumps have been thrown overboard, along with the forestay sail, the jib, the dinghies, and the main anchor. And he finds out that an entire bunch of things have been thrown overboard. The forestay sail, which is a part of the ship, the jib, which is a small sail in the ship, triangular sail in a ship, the dinghies, which are smaller boats, in this case they're probably the lifeboats, and the main anchor. The anchor is what the ship uses to stay in one place. So all of these things have been thrown overboard, and this tells us about the intensity of that wave that crashed over them, right? Because we know earlier in the story that they made an effort to double lash, to like tie everything up tight twice, and despite all of that effort, all of these things have been thrown off. Then I remembered we had another electric pump under the chart room floor. And then Gordon remembers that they have yet another pump that's just sitting around, and it's in the chart room. The chart room is the room in which you keep your maps and all of your navigation material. I connected it to an outpipe and was thankful to find that it worked. And Gordon connects the electric pump to an outpipe being a pipe that leads out into the sea here, in this case. And so he connects that to the electric pump, and when he starts using it, it works. These are a couple of the words that we just discussed that I just gave you definitions for. A forestay sail is support for the mast. So in case you want to take a screenshot of this, go ahead. And this is a theme that I want to stop and talk about a little bit right now. What's happened in this story so far is a lot of ups and downs, right? We start off, things are good, and then we get a little bit in further, things go downhill really fast. There's a big storm. Then Gordon gets thrown off board, and then it seems like he's going to die. The ship is almost capsizing, and then everything starts falling into place again. The ship starts coming back upright, and Gordon manages to make his way back onto the ship, and then they find out that like the ship has holes in it, and the ship seems like it's sinking. And then they start sorting that out with Gordon putting the canvas in places, and then their hand pumps stop working, so it goes down again. So there's this up and down nature to this story, which means good things happen and bad things happen, and good things happen and bad things happen, and part of that makes this story very exhausting to read, because every moment you think that you've just escaped the crisis, you're still in the crisis, you're put back into it. But it's also a good way to think about how crises generally go, right? When we get into situations that are really stressful or something really terrible happens, then you really just actually can't predict what's going to happen next. You can't say, okay, this bad thing has happened, so next there will definitely be something like good that happens and we will be completely free of this crisis soon. Rather, it sort of carries on. It goes in every direction, and it sometimes also goes in bad directions, and then it goes back to being a little better. And that kind of up and downness, the kind of like everything isn't immediately fixed, yeah, that's something that the story tells us really well about how crises work, how something can't immediately be fixed, and in fact you'll have something go well and then something go wrong again, and that's just something that happens. So that's something the story gives us very well. Can you hear me now? Is this slightly better maybe? Okay, you want me to speak a little bit slower? I can do that, yeah. Can you hear me well though? Okay. Alright, great. I think, and can you still hear me well? Okay, great. Then I will continue. Was all of that clear? I can go slower from now, yeah. Okay, great. I will carry on with the lesson then, and I will check again when we reach another part. The night dragged on with an endless, bitterly cold routine of pumping, steering, and working the radio. So the narrator tells us that the night is kind of stretching out. They formed a routine by now. First they pump the water out, and then they steer, and then they're trying to work the radio, and we'll read the next line to figure out why they're working the radio. But these are the three things that they kind of keep doing again and again and again, and it seems endless, which is to say that they've done it so many times that they can't see the end of it. They can't imagine it coming to an end. And it's a bitterly cold routine. And this gives us two things, right? The first thing is that it's actually physically cold for them, because the oceans have just washed over them in the very dramatic wave that's gone over their ship. But it's also bitterly cold in the sense that emotionally it's very exhausting. So they're very tired in that sense also. We were getting no replies to our Mayday calls. Mayday calls are calls that you sent out asking for help. That's why they're using the radio. They're trying to get another ship to notice them and to come and help them. But they're getting no replies to these calls that they're sending out, which was not surprising in this remote corner of the world. And they're actually not surprised that they're not getting any responses, because they're in this very isolated corner of the oceans where ships don't pass by a lot and where there isn't a lot of land either. Sue's head had swollen alarmingly. Sue is Gordon's daughter, and her head has now, which, she said, I got a bump on it, and now it's become like a very large bump. She had two enormous black eyes, and now she showed us a deep cut on her arm. Her head has swollen a lot, her eyes, she has black eyes, which is to say something must have hit her there, because that's how, like, you get bruised around the eyes, right? They go black. And now she showed us a deep cut on her arm, and she also has this deep injury on her arm. When I asked why she hadn't made more of her injuries before this, she replied, "I didn't want to worry you when you were trying to save us all." And the narrator, who is Sue's father, obviously asks, why didn't you tell us about this? Why she hadn't made more of her injuries means why she hadn't spoken about her injuries more seriously before this, or why she hadn't made a big deal about these injuries before this, because these injuries are a big deal. So she is well within, like, her rights to make a big deal about this, and also she is expected to make a big deal out of this and to tell her parents that something's gone wrong, right? And that it's something that's quite serious. But she hasn't done that. And the narrator, like parents do, asks, why didn't you tell us? And she says, I don't want to worry you because you had something else to focus on. And that brings us to a theme, actually. It takes us back, first of all, to that moment when the narrator first is like, oh, Sue has a bump on her head, okay, I have bigger things to deal with right now. And the narrator's not being cruel or rude, as we discussed earlier. The narrator's just being focused on whatever is necessary in that moment. And a bumped head seems like a very small injury. But now the narrator realizes that actually Sue has deliberately made it seem like a small injury. And that she actually has really terrible injuries. And this tells us that there is this characteristic to Sue, which is that she is very thoughtful and she is considerate. In that moment, she's thought ahead, realized that actually they can't afford to focus on her injuries right now, and there are more important things to think about. So she too understands that there are bigger concerns at hand here than herself. So her reply is actually in line with that, rather than something that's trying to, when she says it's just a bump, it's something that's actually kind of thought of this already, rather than something that's trying to attract attention to itself, which is something that we realize in hindsight in this moment. By morning on January 3rd, the pumps had the water level sufficiently under control for us to take 2 hours rest in rotation. So this began on January 2nd, and now it's January 3rd, the morning, and the electric pump is finally like working well enough that the water level is, they're not at risk of drowning anymore, and so they can all take some rests now. And they are deciding to take a rest in rotation, which means that each person will sleep for 2 hours and the rest will be up and doing all of the work that's necessarily to be done in that moment. But we still had a tremendous leak somewhere below the waterline. And on checking, I found that nearly all the boat's main rib frames were smashed down to the keel. In fact, there was nothing holding up a whole section of the starboard hull, except a few cupboard partitions. It is time again for me to sort of try and draw you a terrible, attempt at a ship. Okay, so this is our little boat. Sails that are currently not up, but I'm just drawing them for you anyway. Okay, so imagine that it's in the waves, right? That's the sea. Okay, and this segment of the boat is the one that's below the waterline, and there is a leak somewhere there. And Gordon goes down and checks, and Gordon finds out that, how we know that the starboard side of the ship is bashed in, which means that the right side of the ship has been entirely cracked. Yeah, he finds out that it goes a lot deeper than he thought, and actually it's like pretty much until the very very bottom. This part of the ship is called the keel. So on the right side, entire segments of all the rest of the ship are smashed down, and only the very bottom segment is up and standing. And at one part he says only like some cupboards are the last things left standing. So there's nothing else holding up like that part of the ship at all. So that's very risky because the entire ship is like necessary for it to keep floating. So as they keep going on, they're going to be more at risk of the water kind of breaking the entire ship down altogether. And Gordon knows that. He says, we had survived for 15 hours since the wave hit, but Wave Walker, which is the name of the boat, wouldn't hold together long enough for us to reach Australia. So their initial plans are to go to Australia, but Gordon has realized that given this accident that's happened, it's impossible for them to now reach Australia. The boat is likely to break down before they reach Australia. I checked our charts, that's the navigation charts, and calculated that there were 2 small islands a few hundred kilometers to the east. So Gordon looks at all of the navigation charts and finds out that there must be 2 islands a few hundred kilometers to the east. So still far away, but not as far away as Australia. So something that they possibly could reach. One of them, Ile Amsterdam, was a French scientific base. So one of those islands is this place called Ile Amsterdam, which means New Amsterdam, and it's a scientific base for France. So there will be people there, right? Which is something that they need, because they need someone who can help them, and they need someone who can help them find help. And if it's a scientific base, then they'll have access both to resources and to other people that they can contact for help. Our only hope was to reach these pinpricks in the vast ocean. The pinpricks here are the islands, and Gordon says that the only hope of all the people on Wave Walker is for them to somehow reach these islands. But unless the wind and seas abated so we could hoist sail, our chances would be slim indeed. The great wave had put our auxiliary engine out of action. So this boat has both sails, which use the wind in order to move, and an engine which runs the boat in order to move. But the wave that's come over the boat has killed the engine because it's presumably flooded the engine, and so the engine doesn't work anymore. And so now their only option is the sails. Except they can't raise the sails right now because the wind and the seas are in a really bad state. The sails use these natural forces to move, right? So when the winds are really harsh and really fast, if they put the sails up, then it's likely that they're actually going to go entirely out of control. The boat is going to go out of control, and no one knows what else kind of disaster might fall upon them. So they can't hoist the sails, so they have to keep it down. Which is why Gordon says that unless the wind and the seas abated, which is to say calmed down, came down in intensity, they won't be able to move at all. There are no options left for them right now. A couple of the words in case you wanna screenshots. And a very strong theme that emerges in this paragraph. The crisis itself seems to kind of be over, right? It was a split like couple of minutes long. A wave crashes over the boat, and that's the crisis. But after the crisis is over, there are still the after effects of the crisis left to deal with, which is what they've been dealing with for all this time. And even after they've managed most of those after effects, it's still necessary for them to figure out what to do now, right? There are still a lot of things left to figure out about the future. And the future is still tentative because unless they plot out the next actions that they're going to take well, they still don't know if they'll make it to a safe place, if they'll make it out of this alive, because their boat is still in a tentative position and their lives are still in a tentative position. So despite the fact that there is no immediate thing that is happening, they are still in a state of emergency. And what Gordon does in this moment is kind of take the plans that they have and change those plans as they need to, um, based on the conditions that they're currently in. So initially they were like, we'll go to Australia, but now they found out that it's not possible for them to go to Australia because a bunch of things has happened to them that's stopped them from basically being able to go to Australia. And so because of these conditions, because of these circumstances, Gordon has to change their original plans. And this kind of adaptability is one way to respond to a crisis, right? Improvisation is something that really helps out when we're in stressful situations and terrible things are happening, generally because there isn't a lot of certainty in moments of crisis. You don't know what's going to happen, and so you kind of just have to work with whatever you have in that moment and try to figure out the future as you go along. And our narrator shows this capacity here very well. So that's a characteristic of the narrator that we can take away from here, which is adaptability and the capacity to improvise and sort of just make up plans on the go. I'm going to check the chat again in case you have questions. The chapter isn't over, where we still have like quite a bit of it left. Let me know if everything that's been said so far makes sense to you, or if it doesn't. And I hope you can still hear me. Yes, okay, you can still hear me. And is this louder? Okay. I have reconnected and I am hoping you can hear me better now, like at least by a little bit. If not, I'll just try to speak louder, which maybe will make a difference. Okay, I'm gonna okay, I see. Right, yeah, okay. Alright, I'll see what I can do about that from the next class. I can't really do anything right now. I can like hold my mic up though, which will maybe like work well. A little bit. Okay, I'm gonna carry on. On January 4th, and this story has now spanned across quite a few days, and this crisis has also spanned across quite a few days, 2 entire days now. After 36 hours of continuous pumping, so they've spent 36 hours just pumping water out of their ship, we reached the last few centimeters of water. So all of the water that's been flooding in, they have finally managed to get most of it out, and now they only have like the last few centimeters of water left to pump out. Now we had only to keep pace with the water still coming in, except water is still coming in, right? The waves are still like around them, so water is still going to rush in based on wherever the holes are, but it's still a better situation than the one that they were in before, because now there isn't a backlog of water for them to get rid of. Also, there's only those few centimeters and whatever water is coming in now, so it will be easier for them to get rid of it as and when it comes in. So they have to keep pace, which means they have to be pumping at the same rate as the water that comes in. we could not set any sail on the mainmast. So you know how we found out that the only way for them to basically get anywhere now is to sail? Now we find out that they can't put up a sail because pressure on the rigging would simply pull the damaged section of the hull apart. So we find out that the ropes that hold up the main mast, which is the biggest pole on the ship on which the sail goes up, those ropes, if they put pressure on them, which they'll need to do if they're going to put up the sail, they can't do it, because if they put the pressure, then all those parts that are damaged in the ship, they would get pulled apart further, and if that happens, then the ship will drown. So it's simply not an option for them anymore, so they can't put up the big sails that they have. So we hoisted this storm jib. So they hoisted means raised. So they raised the tiny sail that they had and headed for where I thought the two islands were. And then they head for the islands that Gordon finds out about. Mary found some corned beef and cracker biscuits. So Mary, who's his wife, finds some food for them, and we ate our first meal in almost 2 days. So in the midst of this, they've also been starving. Again, part of this is because half of their ship is wrecked. So a lot of the things that they have presumably been washed out. But part of it might also just be because they've been simply too busy to even consider the prospect of eating in almost 2 days. So both of these are options. These are words again for screenshots. But our respite was short-lived. But their break, this, brief break they've gotten, was short-lived. At 4 p.m., black clouds began building up behind us. Within the hour, the wind was back to 40 knots and the seas were getting higher. At around 4 p.m. that day, the storm clouds are starting to build up again. They're black, so we know they're storm clouds. And then the wind starts getting faster. Knots is a unit of measurement. 40 knots is very, very fast. And the seas are also getting higher. So as the wind starts getting faster, the seas are getting higher, by which the narrator means the waves are getting higher. The weather continued to deteriorate throughout the night. And by dawn on January 5th, our situation was again desperate. So across the course of the night, the weather starts to deteriorate, which means it continues getting worse. And by the time the next morning comes around, they are once again in a very bad situation. This is a very, very, very short-lived respite. It's been all of like a paragraph long of a break that they got and we got. When I went in to comfort the children, John asked, "Daddy, are we going to die?" I tried to assure him that we could make it. "But Daddy," he went on, "we aren't afraid of dying if we can all be together. You and Mummy, Sue and I." So Gordon goes in to comfort the children who are still in the cabin, and his son asks, "Are we going to die?" And this seems to be a very innocent question that he's asking. And Gordon says, no, we're going to be okay. Gordon tries to assure him that they're going to make it. They're going to make it out of this alive, and they're going to be completely fine by the end of it. And then his son says, "But we're not afraid of dying." And he's talking about himself and his sister. And he says, "We're not afraid of dying if we can all be together as a family." And that is very, very weird. What do you make of that? Why do you think he said that? What do you think it means? Someone has asked what rigging means. Rigging means the ropes that you have, that you use to put up a sail on a boat. I hope that makes sense. Yeah? Okay, so John says this very interesting thing, which is we aren't afraid of dying if we can all be together. And there's a lot of acceptance in that, right? There's a lack of fear in that. Very obviously, we're not afraid of dying. Um, and we could read this as just children being too young to understand death or something like that. Maybe not really being aware of what it means, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And maybe we'd be really underestimating children if we understood it to mean that. Rather, John here simply seems to say, okay, well, if it happens, it's okay as long as we're together, and as long as we're together, I won't feel afraid. So, John is really saying, when I'm with all of you, I feel safe. So, this sense of comfort and security and safety that John is finding in the presence of his family, even in this very terrible moment, even when he is considering the fact that at the end of this, he might not be alive, he is okay with it if the rest of his family can be with him. And that is where we get the title of our story, We're Not Afraid to Die If We Can Be Together. It's a title that comes from the children. And the children, they show up very little in the story. There are like 3-4 scenes that they show up. But for all this, all of the emotion in the story somehow seems to come back to them. It's like that moment with Sue when we saw that she's being extra considerate. Like this moment with John when we see that he is okay with like this sense of, with this prospect of dying, provided that his family is there with him. And in both of these cases, both of these children end up showing a lot of consideration for the people around them, right? I mean, when John says, are we going to die? And his father tries to reassure him that no, we're not going to die. John actually ends up sort of trying to reassure his father and says, but it's okay. Like, it isn't that terrifying if we can be together. So, in the same way that Sue was being very understanding and didn't tell her father that, oh, I'm actually really badly injured right now. In the same way, John is also kind of being extra understanding here. And reassuring his parents, his father in this case. I could find no words with which to respond, but I left the children's cabin determined to fight the sea with everything I had. Gordon can't bring himself to respond to that. It's a really difficult thing to hear. I'm okay with dying if we're together. It's the height of an expression of love in one sense. But also the prospect of somebody you love and somebody who loves you that much dying is a very terrifying one. So it's a very complicated sort of set of feelings that are inspired in Gordon, and so Gordon doesn't really have anything that he can say in response to that. So instead he just leaves the cabin, and he leaves determined to fight the sea with everything I have. So his sort of sense of spirit is renewed. He is more focused now. He is more willing to give this entire prospect of getting through this a real shot. To protect the weakened starboard side, I decided to heave to, with the undamaged port hull facing the oncoming waves, using an improvised sea anchor of heavy nylon rope and two 22-liter plastic barrels of paraffin. So Gordon comes up with a new plan because the right side of the boat is damaged. Gordon comes up with a plan to sort of shift the boat around and make sure that the undamaged side of the boat is what is facing the very building waves that are coming. And the way that Gordon turns the boat around is by slowing the boat down and then turning it, and he uses this improvised anchor to slow the boat down because their anchor has gone overboard. So now they don't have an anchor, but they need to slow it down in order to turn. And so he basically picks up like nylon rope that's somewhere in the ship, and there are like these two big barrels of paraffin, which is fuel, for the engine, and he attaches it to the nylon rope, and he uses that as an anchor to slow the boat down, and then he turns the boat so the undamaged side of the boat is going to face the waves. That evening, Mary and I sat together holding hands as the motion of the ship brought more and more water in through the broken planks. We both felt the end was very near. So he and his wife sit together and hold hands, and as the ship moves, more and more water is coming in because the waves are getting big again, and also because there are gaps and holes in the ship everywhere, so more and more water is coming in through those gaps and holes. And both of them are quite convinced that they're all going to die and the ship is going to drown. So we know that when, for instance, Gordon tells his children, oh no, we're definitely going to make it, it's false conviction, right? He isn't actually sure that they're going to make it. In fact, he seems very sure they're not going to make it, and that's the kind of feeling that's been following him around all this time. This worry that things are going to go very badly and things are going to end very badly. But despite that, he tries to reassure his children. That is an interesting phrase. Fight the sea. So this gives us kind of an implication that Gordon is fighting a battle against the ocean, right? It's a sort of war between these people on this tiny little ship and the entire ocean. And one more thing we should talk about as a theme from the last paragraph is that very last line, which is, we both felt the end was near, and how they're both convinced that they're all likely going to die. And it seems like they've given up, which is a very ordinary reaction, because they've just been struggling for many, many days, and there's just been no hope for them across all those days. And now things seem to be getting really bad again, and there is no way to get help. And so it's a very organic, natural feeling to have, that sort of resignation. There's pretty much very little left to feel after that, except this kind of, okay, we've reached the end now. But Wave Walker rode out the storm, and by the morning of January 6th, with the wind easing, I tried to get a reading on the sextant. But despite their worst fears, their boat manages to ride out another storm, and on January 6th, the wind finally slows down, and Gordon goes and tries to get a reading on. So the sextant is this instrument that you use to determine distances, and so he goes and he tries to use this instrument, try to figure out exactly where they are and how to get to that island that he already plotted that they should get towards. Back in the chart room, so back in the navigation room, I worked on wind speeds, changes of course, drift and current. So he's trying to, in an effort to calculate our position. So they're in the sea, right? And there are no markers in the sea of where you are or which particular location you're in. It's just entire expanses of waves that go on in every direction. So if you get lost when you're on the sea, you simply can't easily find out where you are. And so he's sitting down and he's trying to do a lot of calculations in order to figure out where they are from the last place where they were. He is using the wind speed, he's using the ways in which they've changed directions all this while. He's trying to calculate how the current of the water has probably played into it. And using all of this, he's trying to figure out where they are in the sea. The best I could determine was that we were somewhere in 150,000 kilometers of ocean, looking for a 65-kilometer wide island. These are not very promising odds. So the best that Gordon can figure out by the end of doing all of these calculations is, oh, there is this big stretch of ocean that we are most probably in, and that big stretch of ocean is 150,000 kilometers wide, which is a very, very, very big stretch. And in that 150,000 kilometers, they're looking for a very, very, very small island. So very honestly, the odds are against them, which is to say that it doesn't look likely that they're going to be able to find the island, because it's simply too small in this large stretch of land, and Gordon can't exactly figure out where they are at all. He can only locate them somewhere in this broad stretch of land. Sea, not land. Sorry. So yeah, that's sextant. What characteristic does this paragraph give us about the narrator? Right? Repeatedly, across the course of this lesson, from the very beginning to now, again and again and again, things have gone wrong. Things have gotten better sometimes, but then they've continued to go wrong, and things have just simply gotten worse. And yet, the narrator kind of gets back up and goes back into the charting room and tries to figure out what to do, right? He's still making all of these calculations. He's still trying to get them out of there. He's still trying for all of them to survive. And this gives us a very interesting characteristic of everybody in general. Even in situations when it seems like we should have just given up hope and sort of laid down and said, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to do this anymore. We sometimes have this tendency to get back and say, okay, let me start again from the beginning. What can I do to sort this out? And then sit down, put down all of the things that you can do to sort this out, and go and sort of try that list out. And that's what the narrator does here. Puts down all of these calculations and says, okay, let's try again. And that's very interesting kind of characteristic that people share. I'm gonna check the chat again to see if there are questions. Mamoni has replied, he is ready to die in case he faces it. Okay, I think you were answering my question earlier. Thanks for that. Hello to Hakuna Matata and Ayan Parvez, sorry about that, asks about class 12. Class 12 is Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, Ayan. Okay. While I was thinking, Sue, moving painfully, joined me. The left side of her head was now very swollen, and her blackened eyes narrowed to slits. She gave me a card she had made. So while the narrator is sitting around plotting all of this, and the narrator is again feeling a little like, how are we going to do this, because these odds look very bad, his daughter comes towards him, and his daughter is finding it difficult to even move right now because the left side of her head is really very swollen, and her eyes are so bruised that now they've just become really small. She can't open them more than that because that's how bruised her face is. And she gives him a card. On the front, she had drawn caricatures of Mary and me with the words, "Here are some funny people. Did they make you laugh? I laughed a lot as well." Caricatures sort of exaggerated drawings, right? It's when you try to draw someone and you deliberately make the drawing look funny. You draw them with like really weird noses or like weird ears or like funny face expressions, things like that. So she's drawn them in a funny way, and she says, "Here are some funny people." And then she says, "Does looking at these drawings make you laugh? Drawing them made me laugh a lot." Inside was a message, and inside the card she's written, "Oh, how I love you both." So this card is to say thank you and let's hope for the best. And inside the card, Sue has written that she loves her parents and that she just wants to say thank you to them. And why does she want to say thank you? In case this is the end, right? In case there is no future after this. And then she says, "And let's hope for the best. Let's hope we make it out of this." Somehow we had to make it. And again, the narrator says, somehow we will make it out of this. Like, in one way or the other, we've got to get out of this okay. And we will talk a bit about a bunch of the themes that this is thrown out. Mamoni, the session will go on until like 7:15. I think we are almost done. There's a very interesting contrast that's being set up here. So we have the adults who are looking at all of these practicalities and who are trying very hard to sort the situation out, and they're putting a lot of effort into it, but in the process they're sort of also thinking, we're not going to make it out, this isn't really going to happen. The narrator and his wife have been sitting together just the evening before thinking, oh, we're all going to die here. And then there are the children who can't really do a lot to help, but they're still trying to help in this odd way of their own. They're trying to express their love for their parents, right? So this girl makes like a card and she says, oh, I hope we'll make it out. Let's hope for the best. And so there's this distinct contrast between the way, say, Suzanne reacts to the event and the way that Gordon is reacting to the event. So that sense of hopelessness that is pervading Gordon is not quite there in Suzanne. She is still saying, let's hope for the best. And she inspires that in Gordon too, right? When she writes something like that, he says, okay, we have to do this. We will somehow make it out alive. So that hopelessness and sense of hope is like a contrast between the adults and the children, but also a sort of frustration that's there in the adults because of all of these days that have been so terrible and so bad, and a sense of resignation, a sense of giving up a little bit. And in contrast, these children are kind of okay with, they're not okay with terrible things happening, but they can kind of accept even the possibility of like death, right? As John did, provided that they're with the people that they love. So two very different kinds of reactions that are going on, and it's a little difficult to pin down why it is that they're reacting in such different ways, but probably part of it is that you kind of get older and sort of this responsibility begins to weigh down on you, and you get used to things kind of going really, really bad, and you get used to thinking about all the ways in which things can go really, really bad and really, really wrong. So that sort of knowledge that things could go wrong, and that sort of the fact that, for instance, in this case, these adults are the ones who are responsible for getting them out of the situation, that sort of weight of responsibility that rests on them, both of those things are likely going to be playing a role in why these adults are feeling a lot more hopeless and a lot more frustrated, and the children are reacting in a much more innocent way, in a less tired of the world, wary of everything in the world way. Because think about it, who would make a card for somebody else when everyone else is on the verge of dying, right? When you're really afraid that everybody is going to die. But this girl, she goes and does that. She makes a card, and that's just a really simple act of love that still inspires a sort of resurgence of determination in our narrator, who says somehow we had to make it. Yeah, so the children become, in both of the examples, this example with Sue and the previous example with John, in which he says that line about dying, they become a motivation for the parents to sort of try harder, in this case for Gordon to push himself again. So love sort of that inspires, but also just a reminder that there are other people also at stake here, I checked and rechecked my calculations. We had lost our main compass, and I was using a spare which had not been corrected for magnetic variation. So Gordon checks and rechecks the calculations that he made. He says that they've lost their main compass, which is what they used to navigate on the seas. So now he's using a spare compass, and the problem with the spare compass is that it's not been corrected for magnetic variation. When magnets are near things that are made of iron, like a ship, they generally get affected by it, and the compass is, it contains a magnet. So because they get affected by it, generally what people do is they pre-correct magnets to make sure that they'll work accurately anyway. But this is a spare magnet, so it's not been corrected, and yet he is going to have to use it because it's all they have. I made an allowance for this, so he takes this into consideration in his calculations. And another estimate of the influence of the westerly currents which flow through this part of the Indian Ocean. And he includes the fact that there are the westerly winds. That's just a name for wind, a particular set of winds. You may have studied about them in school, actually. He takes that also into consideration, and he rechecks his calculations using these things also. About 2 p.m., I went on deck and asked Larry to steer a course of 185 degrees. Based on all of this, he figures out where he thinks they are, and he says, okay, I think this is the direction that we should go in. And he goes up and he asks his crew member to take the ship in a particular direction at a particular angle. If we were lucky, I told him with a conviction I did not feel, he could expect to see the island at about 5 p.m. So the narrator says, you know, if we're lucky, then we will see the island at 5 p.m. in 3 more hours. And when he says this to Larry, he says it with conviction. He sounds convinced that it will happen, but it's a conviction that he doesn't feel. So he isn't actually feeling convinced. He's just pretending that he feels so. Then with a heavy heart, I went below, climbed on my bunk, and amazingly dozed off. And he's feeling very uncertain, and he's heavy-hearted because he doesn't feel any sort of conviction that they'll see the island. He's in fact quite certain that they won't. So he goes down, he lies down, and surprisingly he even falls asleep. When I woke, it was 6 p.m. and growing dark. He wakes up an entire hour after he tells Larry that the island should be reached. It's 6 p.m., it's dark outside, he wakes up, nobody's come to tell him they've reached the island. I know we must have missed the island. And because nobody's told him anything, he assumes, oh, we must have missed the island. You know, I've woken up, we're still on the seas, we're still in the boat. We must still just be lost on the ocean. And with the sail we had left, we couldn't hope to beat back into the westerly winds. And the narrator says, they only have like one sail left, right? One sail that they can use right now because the rest of the ship can't really put up another sail without the ship falling apart. So he says the sail isn't strong enough for us to try to go back in another direction because the winds are too strong for us to go back in another direction and try to find the island. We must have gone, can't go back in that direction. And that's a very desperate, scary moment. Some definitions. Yeah, what a conviction I did not feel means, and the narrator thinks it's, you know, he says, amazingly I dozed off, and he just means that in such a situation, in such dire circumstances, under such stress, he's very surprised that he fell asleep. At that moment, a tousled head appeared by my bunk. Tousled is like ruffled hair, so a head with like ruffled hair appears by his sleeping place. Can I have a hug? Jonathan asked. Jonathan is John. Sue was right behind him. So both of his children come, and his son asks, can I have a hug? And why am I getting a hug now? I asked. And the narrator's like very unsure why he's getting a hug right now. Probably because he also doesn't feel like he deserves a hug right now, because he thinks he's led them astray on the ocean, that he's calculated wrong, and that because of his mistakes now they're just lost on the ocean, so he's holding himself responsible here. Because you're the best daddy in the whole world, and the best captain, my son replied. And John says, you're the best. Not only are you the best father, you're also the best ship captain. Not today, John, I'm afraid. And the narrator says, well, maybe on other days, but not today. I haven't been the best dad or the best captain today. And again, this says that the narrator is very, very convinced that they are entirely lost, and that they've missed the ocean, the island. They've missed the island because of his calculations. So he feels sense of responsibility, and so today he thinks he's not a good captain, or a good father? Why, you must be, said Sue in a matter-of-fact voice. You found the island. And his daughter says, well, you must be, no matter what you say. And she says it in a very matter-of-fact voice. She doesn't say it like it's a big deal. She just says it very casually. And she's like, oh, you found the island. What? I shouted. And the narrator is absolutely shocked. He shouts, he's like, what? It's out there in front of us, they chorused, as big as a battleship. And they say the island is right there in front of us. It's as big as a battleship. And so the children bring us the end of this story. They give us good news for all of the crisis that's been going on. And it's an appropriate end because sorry, give me a second. It's very appropriate that it's the children who bring this good news to the narrator in the end, because across the story repeatedly it's the children who have inspired him to work towards this good news, right? Towards this possibility of going towards the island. Every time he feels like giving up, they're the ones who've said something or done something that's given him some sort of drive to actually work towards getting them safe and sound to this island. So the fact that they're the ones who come and tell him, hey, we found the island, it's a really nice, neat ending there. And one of the interesting thing is that it said, they say the island is in front of us and it's as big as a battleship. You know, that's interesting because this island is going to be, it's their savior, right? It's their only way to rescue themselves, and they found the island. And what are they comparing it to? They're comparing it to a battleship. Now they're comparing it in terms of size, but still the implication is there that what saved them is being compared to a ship, which is very interesting because what's wrecked them and put them in this place has also been a ship, which is Wave Walker, and yet at the same time it has been Wave Walker which has also somehow brought them all this far. So very interesting that ship almost wrecked them, and yet the ship also brought them this far, and what is about to save them, which is the island, is also being compared to a ship. I rushed on deck and gazed with relief at the stark outline of Ile Amsterdam. So the narrator runs upstairs and he looks at the outline of the island that's there in front of them. It was only a bleak piece of volcanic rock with little vegetation. The most beautiful island in the world. So the island itself is really quite dull. It's just volcanic rock, which is something on which a lot of trees and a lot of things can't grow. So there's very little vegetation, there's very little plant life there on the island. And it's, to the narrator, it's the most beautiful island in the world. They anchored offshore for the night. And the next morning, all 28 inhabitants of the island cheered as they helped us ashore. So for that night, they just put down anchor there. They just set the ship down there and they stay on the ship. And the next morning, there are 28 people on the island. It's a very small island. It's a scientific base. So the 28 people who live there help these people from the ship onto the shore, and they all cheer for them. They've probably heard this story, and this is a show of support, of respect and admiration also for them having made it through all of this alive to the other end. This is an interesting phrase. It's the most beautiful island in the world. It's actually not. It's really a very mediocre island. It's considered, he describes it as being bleak, which means really kind of misery inspiring and dull, and there isn't much plant life on it, so it's quite a mediocre island. But it's such a relief to be there that it seems like the most beautiful island in the world, because it is a sign of them being okay now, of them being safe now. With land under my feet again, now that they're finally safe again, my thoughts were full of Larry and Herbie, cheerful and optimistic under the direst stress, and of Mary, who stayed at the wheel for all those crucial hours. So now that they're safe again, the narrator can only think about all of the other people who were in this situation with him. His crewmates who remained cheerful and happy even though things were really, really getting bad. His wife who stayed at the wheel and guided the wheel for all those hours, when they were on the sea, and when he was pumping the water out, and presumably at other times also. Most of all, I thought of a 7-year-old girl who did not want us to worry about head injury, which subsequently took 6 minor operations to remove a recurring blood clot between skin and skull, and of a 6-year-old boy who was not afraid to die. But most of all, the narrator thinks about his children, his daughter, who didn't tell them about her head injury because she didn't want them to worry too much, and about his son, who says that he is not afraid to die if he is with his parents and his sister. And in fact, that head injury, like right here, eventually it takes like 6 small operations to. There's like a blood clot that's formed between her skin and her skull, and to remove it they need like 6 operations. And so as we reach the very end of the story, the narrator's thoughts sort of go outward. He stops thinking about actions and what's happening and what to do next, and thinks about all of the rest of the people around him and how they've played a role in how they've finally gotten here. And most of all, he thinks about the children, because the children are the people who have, as we've seen throughout the story, inspired him most of all to try a little harder, to keep going a little longer. And then he ends with saying a couple of things about both of his children. He tells us about the fact that it takes 6 operations to remove the blood clot, and that is the injury that Sue didn't want them to worry about. So really it's a very, very bad injury, right? The fact that it takes 6 operations shows us how bad it is. So even though it was really bad, Sue tried to say that it wasn't that bad in the beginning so they wouldn't worry. And so this kind of emphasizes for us again Sue's consideration and her empathy for her family in this moment. And then we have John, who expresses like love for his family. And this story ends with with the words of a 6-year-old boy who was not afraid to die. And so we end with John, who gave us the words at the title, and we end with the very words that are actually the words at the title. And the fact that this is our ending paragraph is interesting. And when I quickly do like big themes in this story, which I'm going to do right now, we'll talk about that ending paragraph. I'm just going to check the chat again. Okay, a lot of people have said a lot of things. What is my name? My name is Shree. I am from Unacademy, and I am in the Unacademy app. You can find me if you type in SHREE and then THAARSHINI. So really I have a very long name, but I'm definitely there. Yeah. There should also be a link to my profile in the description box, so you can find that there. As for the English and the Hindi question, I am afraid I don't know Hindi, so I do teach only in English. But if you don't understand things, then please let me know which specific parts you don't understand, and we can go over that again, and we can kind of try to make that more understandable for you in whatever way works. So yeah, that's something for all of you. And a couple of the themes in this story, the big themes in this story. One is this kind of battle between nature and human beings, right? On one hand we have the sea, on the other hand we have these people on this tiny boat who are trying very hard to overcome everything that the sea is throwing at them. And a lot of ideas are there, such as how unpredictable nature can be, the way that we are quite helpless sometimes in the face of nature and the things that nature can throw at us. So we do end up in sort of desperate situations because of the ways that nature can be so powerful and such a strong force and so unpredictable. So that's a lot of things there. And how human beings can end up being sort of very small in front of the very big thing that nature can be. And yet, at the end of this story, somehow the humans do make it out alive, and that tells us a sort of, that gives us a little bit of an instruction manual for a crisis, actually. This story is kind of reminding us that, you know, when we're stuck in a really bad place, all we can really do is try to overcome it and try to adapt to the situation and improvise and do whatever we can with whatever we have. Even if it means that, you know, if we don't have an anchor and we have to use like fuel barrels to make an anchor for ourselves, then that's just something that we have to do. So whatever you have available in front of you, whatever tools, whatever resources, use them as much as you can, and use them in innovative ways to try to get yourself out of whatever terrible situation you're in. And most importantly, it's a story about how to take sort of support from others in the middle of a crisis, how to find inspiration in the people around you. And that's why it's very interesting that this is the paragraph that this story ends on, right? It ends with the narrator thinking about everybody else around him. It ends with the narrator being grateful for everybody else around him. And that tells us basically that, you know, for all that, there's this idea that we have to do things on our own and we have to get through things on our own. Very often when we're in very bad circumstances, the way to get through it can often be to find support and to find comfort in all the people around you, to find support especially in the love of people, as the narrator finds inspiration and drive from the love of his children. So that is something that we can end this story with. Anyway, that is all I have for you today. I hope you somewhat liked the lesson, and I hope it was somewhat clear to you. If you are looking for more such content like this, then you should go ahead and download the Unacademy app. You get a bunch of features for free on it. You'll get free access to study material, to live tests, quizzes, and things like that. My code is THAR01. You can use that, especially in case you want to get an Unacademy Plus subscription. If you get a subscription, you basically get free access to all the courses that are around, and you get access to mentorship from educators. You get access to all the study material that's around, and you get access to lots more practice tests, lots more live tests, and very, very thorough coverage of like all the syllabi of every subject. So that's Unacademy Plus, and these are the costs of getting a subscription to Unacademy Plus. The per month cost reduces as we go into durations that are for longer. So if you get a subscription for a longer duration of time, your per month cost will actually be a lot less. That's something that you should keep in mind. You can also use my code to get like a flat 10% off on Unacademy Plus. And there's something also called Unacademy Iconic, which is a much more one-on-one education benefit thing. So if, for instance, you want your own personal like guide who will support you and help you figure things out, then Unacademy Iconic is for you. You'll also have access here to like weekly reports. Your parents will get to talk to like people to educators to figure out how you're doing. You'll have access to live doubt solving sessions where you can basically just meet people to talk about all of the doubts that you have and get all of them cleared out. And again, these are the prices for Unacademy Iconic, and again, the cost is different based on how many months you take it for. For 18 months, for instance, it's a lot less expensive than for like 6 months. The per month cost is a lot lower here. And again, there is referral code that you can add, and you can minus a THER01, as I said. All that said, I hope you liked today's class. It's really overshot its limit, but if you liked it, then let me know. If I can do things differently for you, then let me know that. Leave a comment with your thoughts or your feedback. I will be looking out for them. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching this, and do subscribe if you're looking for more content like this. I will see you again very soon.